He hit her in front of everyone, and the sound was small, but it carried like a secret finally said out loud, and she didn't swing back because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still and let the truth do its work. It happened outside a coffee shop on Riverside, cold breath in the air, a line of morning people pretending the day was normal, and the officer's name was Ryan Hale, while her name was Dr. Naomi Reed. Calm eyes, white coat, a folder tucked to her ribs like it held something more important than paperwork. He said, "Stop." She asked why, and that tiny question, "Is there a reason, officer?" cut straight through whatever story he'd already written in his head. You know what I mean? When somebody hears a question and only feels a challenge when respect is what they want and control is the only way they know how to ask for it. She set her coffee down, opened her wallet slow, that was all, and the early light hit a small metal emblem inside. A bird's wings, not flashy, just deliberate. And you could see the fuse in him catch because certainty meeting ambiguity is like dry grass meeting a match. He barked, "Hands where I can see them." Her hands were already out. She said, "You're making a mistake, not with heat, with certainty," which to some men is worse. And then his fist hit the side of her face, flat and dumb, and the whole block inhaled at once. She didn't crumple. She straightened her coat like she was smoothing a bedsheet, lifted her chin, looked right at him and let disappointment sink in where anger would have bounced off. "Like I said, officer, you've made a mistake." And the phones came up along the sidewalk as if the street itself grew eyes. In the cruiser, he shut off the radio when a breaking alert mentioned a video of an officer striking a woman outside a Riverside cafe. His neck stripe darkened. He muttered, "You people always play victim," she said. "Truth doesn't need victims, soft as steam," and it landed because there are sentences that don't need a volume knob. They just need a moment of quiet to bloom. The station fluorescents hummed hard. Bleach in the air, a bulletin board with last month's potluck flyer, Lieutenant Karen Doyle at the door with sleeves rolled and a face that didn't do theater. "What's the charge?" she asked. "Attitude," he said. And hearing an adult say that out loud like it was a crime made the room feel smaller. At booking, the system blinked the way old machines blink right before they remember something they wish they'd forgotten. Federal clearance detected. Level Omega. And the lights dipped and the cuffs on Naomi's wrists tightened by themselves until metal squealed and Ryan stumbled backward like the floor slid a few inches. "What did you do?" he hissed at the air because men like that never think the room is talking back. Naomi didn't move. She just tilted her eyes to the ceiling like she could hear a different frequency. And when Lieutenant Doyle leaned over Officer Julia West's shoulder, Julia being young, bright, the kind of cop who still believes a form can hold the truth if you fill it out right, the monitor flashed a single line of red text, "Access denied, Project Phoenix," and the generator kicked on and washed the walls in emergency glow. "Who are you?" Doyle asked. Not like an interrogator, but like a woman who sees a curve in the road she didn't know was there. "Someone you were never supposed to arrest," Naomi said, gentle as a nurse removing a bandage, and silence did the rest. They put her in a room with a table that rocked and a chair that forgot. It used to shine, and Ryan paced behind the glass while Julia watched the heart rate feed that barely lifted above resting. Not bravado, not shock. Something steadier, almost like meditation, almost like choice. "Run her prints again," Doyle said, and the system spat out a warning nobody on that floor had ever seen. "Unauthorized biometric detected. CIA protocol lockdown." And Julia said under her breath that the implant flag was real and rare and older than any of their training, and Ryan laughed that tight laugh you use when the ground tilts. "She's not CIA, she's just a woman who wouldn't follow an order," and no one answered because the room had already answered for them. Ryan sat to write his report. Suspect resisted verbal command. And the sentence erased itself, letter by letter, cursor blinking like a metronome that kept time with his pulse. And he tried again and the new sentence slid away too. And Naomi lifted her eyes toward the glass and said in a voice as even as a level no, "Your integrity is," and you could feel the hinge inside him bend. The video went up because truth likes a wide path, not a chopped clip, the raw thing, the coffee cup click, the quiet before the hit, the stillness after. And it crawled from phone to phone until the whole city could feel the gap between force and authority like a bruise they didn't know they had. Hashtags burped forth because the internet can't help itself. But the one that stuck wasn't clever. It was simple, the silent agent, and people argued in their kitchens while eggs got cold, and some cried, and some said she set him up, and some watched their own breath fog the screen and didn't know why they felt so heavy. Julia, who had a conscience with its hand raised, looked at Doyle and said, "If we bury this, we bury ourselves." And Doyle stood there long enough to prove she was thinking before saying, "Do it before I change my mind." And that was the dam breaking with a single push. Ryan got suspended before the day ended and went home to an apartment that suddenly felt rented from a past life. Blinds drawn, TV blue, a frame frozen of his fist, midair like a portrait of a moment he'd never escape. His phone buzzed until the department seized it and the bank flagged his account for reasons he'd once told other people were routine, and he tried to sleep and saw her face in the bathroom mirror for one split second, then his own, then hers again, and he said, "Get out of my head." And of course she wasn't there because nothing had entered his mind but everything he'd tried to keep out. The agency called Julia, not with lights and sirens, with a quiet morning and a badge check in a building with no name on the door, and a man with a calm tie opened a folder that said, "Naomi Reed, Division Phoenix," and explained in tidy sentences what happens when a nation tries to cure moral numbness without breaking bones. Resonance, he said, like a tuning fork held near a stubborn string. Not control, influence, recalibration, make the conscience audible again. And then he said, why it ended. Because someone always wants to weaponize what was meant to heal. And Naomi walked away before the project became a tool for cruelty, and he slid a handwritten line across the table. Justice doesn't punish, it reminds, and Julia sat there and realized she had joined the right fight on accident. The twist wasn't the CIA label. The twist was that Naomi didn't push anything into anyone. She took noise out, she held up a mirror, she waited. And that waiting, that stillness started doing what lectures never do. It made people hear themselves. He showed up at her door after the hearing. Former officer, the chair had said, and that word is a heavy kind of mercy. You lose the costume and find the man inside. And he knocked 3 times in rain that hung like a curtain. And her smart doorbell went live without anyone thinking about it because tech is nosy and relentless. And when she opened, he looked like a structure after the fire. Standing, but everything soft inside turned to ash. I need to understand, he said. And she stepped back just enough to let him cross the threshold because there's a difference between punishment and truth. And this moment was about truth. Why didn't you hit me back? He asked. And she said, because then you'd never see who you are. And he sat, and she told him what power without soul feels like. Empty, loud, hungry. And he said, I thought I was in control. And she said, that wasn't control. That was fear in a uniform. And he whispered, do you hate me? And she said, no, I don't carry hate. And he said, then why does this feel like punishment? And she said, it's not punishment, it's feeling. And he broke open, not dramatic human, the kind of crying you don't brag about later, and she put her hand over her heart and said, you called me powerless. Now you know what power is, and that moment, that line, walked across screens like a quiet sermon. The country argued, of course. Some said manipulation, some said miracle, some said finally, and the Department of Justice announced an independent investigation because sometimes pressure does what decency should have done first, and city councils scheduled meetings that weren't performative for once, and officers who'd never cried on duty sat alone in their cars and stared at their hands and asked themselves who they had become. Ryan got fired in a room that smelled like floor polish and old careers. No applause, no hatred, just paperwork and a badge set on a table, a small metal circle suddenly too heavy. And he left breathing like a man who had forgotten how to do that basic thing without instructions. And the next morning he wrote names on a sheet of paper, people he had treated like obstacles instead of citizens, and he started knocking on doors. An old mechanic who still kept the first wrench his father gave him, a teenage protester who had learned to flinch at uniforms, a woman whose laughter had sounded like relief when a citation got tossed. And some people closed the door and some said, get off my porch. And a few said, at least you see now, and he nodded and carried those words like water. At the station, Julia got suspended because truth has a price, and she paid it without pretending it didn't hurt, and Doyle watched her pack her locker and said, they'll bury you for this. And Julia smiled like a person who has decided what matters and said, then let it end for something true. And when she stepped into the morning, she saw candles along the fence and poster board with handwriting that said, silence speaks, and you could tell the city had decided to use its inside voice for once. The news kept calling Naomi an enigma and a symbol, and a lot of other words people reach for when a person refuses to fit a headline. The CIA declined to confirm or deny. The agency said no record found, which in that world might mean 100 things, but the kids at the community center started learning a new sign with their hands, Phoenix, and that felt like the only confirmation that mattered. You want to know what Naomi did with the so-called secret power? She did the oldest thing, the simplest thing, the thing grandmothers do when they lift a chin after bad news. She handed the mirror back and said, look, really look, and then she stepped away so the person could choose. Yeah, that happened. Not lightning, not mind control, just space. Enough space to hear a small voice that had been trying to get a word in for years. Operation Phoenix, or Project Phoenix depending on whose file you read, concluded on paper a task force dismantled units that should have fallen long ago. Monitors got hired, trainings got longer and a little braver, and you can argue reform is window dressing, or you can watch a rookie put their hand over their chest in a mirror before a shift and whisper a promise to an invisible audience, do better. And tell me that doesn't count for something. Ryan took a job nobody live streams. Mornings in church basements with burnt coffee where he tells new officers how fast pride turns into a punch. If you let it, afternoons with families who don't want apologies. They want change evenings sitting on the curb with kids who only believe what they can touch and still somehow trust a quiet man more than a loud plan. And he doesn't ask for forgiveness in public because forgiveness is not a stage trick. It is slow carpentry, and on good days, he helps someone else lay one good plank. Naomi didn't vanish because people like to say strong women disappear when the news cycle moves on. She just changed the battlefield, and if you caught the glint of a black SUV window idling by the curb outside the center one morning and felt the hairs on your arm lift, you might have seen a silhouette raise her eyes and nod once as if to say, keep going. And maybe you imagined it, but maybe the best proofs